The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We'll give folks another minute to join and we'll start the webinar approximately 1 minute. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Data Classification, Building a Foundation for Data Security and Privacy. Before we start the webinar, we'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. We want to hear from you and encourage our participants to ask questions. To do so, enter your question into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar panel. After the webinar, a copy of the presentation will be sent to all our participants. So again, thank you for joining us today, and now I'd like to hand it over to our presenters, Heidi Shey, Senior Analyst of Forrester, and A.G. Crum, Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Spirion. Heidi?
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
And, well, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. So what AG and I have planned is just a bit of a back and forth and discussion about data classification, some of the gotchas that we've come across, stories that we've heard from companies that we've talked to, considerations for classification, as well as how it ties in to DLP, and a couple of tips toward the end for how to help you build your case for doing data classification within your company. Next slide, please. All right, so there's a bit of a roadmap involved for data classification. Oftentimes I talk to folks who come at it with the impression that, okay, we'll just purchase some kind of tool, some kind of technology, and off to the races we go. I think it takes a bit more planning up on the front end to help make this into a successful initiative. And these were just 4 of the key, I think, targets or maybe milestones that I feel are pretty important in this process. I mean, the first one is at the bottom there, level up your understanding of sensitive data. I think when people really start thinking about what constitutes sensitive data, not just from a regulatory perspective, but also just within their own organization, it starts to really build out to encompass a lot of different things that maybe they didn't even consider before. That's one part of the roadmap here. Another one is to identify just what is data's role within your organization. So this includes things like, well, why are we collecting certain types of customer information? For example, what do we use this for? What kind of benefit is it generating? Who can use this? How is it used? Just getting a better understanding of what the business is trying to do with this data can help, not just in building out what your classification schemes or labels would look like, but better helping you to understand just how employees should be handling that information and the kinds of security controls you would need to consider for that type of data.
Yeah, I would add, like, one piece there is that is the data an asset to you, or is it actually a liability? Is it a risk to you? So.
Totally. That's a big question to consider there, because at that point, I mean, if it's really this liability, there would be some other decisions that would need to be made. And then we get to the point of, well, building out your classification scheme. So with that understanding of the data, the understanding of its role, it gives you a better foundation to start thinking about, well, what are those classification labels that we should be using? What's going to be easily understood? within the workforce. And then we've got that the change management strategy toward the end. These are all things that you'd be doing and planning for before you even roll out any kind of tool. And what I mean by change management here is it's both the part of figuring out just how you're going to communicate this initiative to your employees. What's their expected role in data classification? What are they expected to do? But then it's also the other side of it of, well, how should they be expected to handle data if it's classified a particular way? What are their responsibilities? And just going back to the point about leveling up your understanding of sensitive data, we've got a little equation that I typically like to walk folks through, and it's on the next slide. And this is something that just helps to illustrate how it's, data sensitivity, it's not always clear-cut. And when I talk about sensitive data, I call it toxic data. It's toxic because if this was data that was to be exposed or taken, stolen, lost, compromised in some way, it would be toxic or harmful to your organization. And it's comprised of the 3 Ps plus IP. So that's one way to start identifying what toxic data would be. The 3 Ps include PCI, personal cardholder information, PHI, personal healthcare information, and then PII, personally identifiable information. And typically the 3 Ps, these are, you could call this regulated information, data that falls under some compliance requirement of some sort. And then intellectual property, a little bit more of a squishy area here. Sometimes it's straightforward in terms of what your intellectual property would be. Other times you can also start to pull in, say, sensitive corporate data under this bucket as well. So something like an executive's travel itinerary. It's like, yes, you might consider that personal information, but it's also sensitive corporate information as well, because it might tell you about something to do with the company's strategy in terms of who this person might be meeting with, where they're going, what they're doing. Things like meeting notes and meeting agendas, this could also fall under this category of sensitive corporate information as well. But even though the 3 Ps are, say, regulated data, it's stuff you'd find with compliance, that doesn't mean it's really clear what that is either. The next slide, please. When we talk about personal data, it's a wide range of information types. This is just a snippet here from the EU GDPR. So as you can see, it's things like name, identification number. Yes, this is stuff that we typically think about as personal. But then once we get to other things like, say, factors specific to the physical, the mental, economic, and so on, you can start to see that this really broadens out what falls under this umbrella of personal data. And the next slide, please. So we talk about customer data a lot when we talk about personal data, but we have to remember that this also applies to employee personal data. And this also covers more than just what we might typically think of as PII. When we think of employee data, it could be things like, well, say you're putting in a suite to handle DLP, data loss prevention. This is essentially monitoring. So the kinds of activities that employees are doing on the network, what they're generating, that type of information could be considered personal as well. You might run into some privacy issues in certain jurisdictions. But something else like an expense report from a trip to Vegas, this could be considered personal data as well. If we think about the kinds of, let's say, habits that people might have, their preferences, this translates into what they end up doing when they're on a business trip. I like to think of the example of, well, if I were to put, say, my anonymized expense report in front of my manager with a bunch of other anonymized expense reports, I get the feeling that she could likely pick out which one was me based on a couple of factors. For example, the car service that I would use to get from my home to the airport, it's typically around the same price. It doesn't vary all that much. She's not going to see too many receipts and expenses for a large bar tab, except for maybe that one time at Black Hat, but overall, that's not something that she typically sees on one of my expenses, and so on. But if we think about the kinds of, let's say, other expenses, like, say, food choices for meals, this could be an indicator of some kind of medical condition, or maybe it could indicate some type of religious observance that the employee has. So once we start to tease these things out and dive deeper into something as, I guess, simple as an expense report, it tells us quite a bit about a person. All right, and on to the next slide. So oftentimes, I think, I don't know if you've seen this as well, AG, but in conversations about classification, it almost seems like people think that it's this static thing. You label something as
label one and done. Yeah,
one and done, but that's not really the case. If we think about the data lifecycle, sensitivity can certainly change over time. So I think the common example that we might see here could be financial reporting for a public company. Before that all gets reported, it's highly sensitive, highly confidential. You don't want those numbers to leak. But after the earnings call, after the reporting, it's out there. And so the level of sensitivity for that final report, well, it's public information now. And if you have classification in place, that label should change with that new status. Yep. And next slide, please. So as we get going with classification, I think there's three key things, three tips here that we can share some stories behind them as well to help and to consider as best practices. So often I get asked the question of, well, what do I focus on? The data that we already have, or do I focus on the new stuff that's being created today? And I think the reasoning behind this question is companies feel a bit overwhelmed when they think about embarking on data classification, because they're thinking about, well, the volumes of data that they have. It's almost like, my gosh, we're trying to boil the ocean here. So to split it into two different initiatives, classifying existing data versus classifying new data, I think that helps to reduce at least the initial scope of what you might be trying to do. And I typically point to the focus on the new data first as a way of stopping that bleeding.
Yeah, I think I think on the new data, legacy data, it's kind of an interesting concept. I mean, I think it can be overwhelming at times. I think if you think about some of the technologies that are out there, and if you think about just labeling, and then how do you actually apply a label, you kind of create this problem of discovery. And how can I label 3 terabytes of data? You kind of, I mean, it's going to take a long time to do that. So I think your suggestion of focusing on new data makes sense there when you're just talking about just applying data, applying a label to new data. I think with some technologies out there, I would say Spirion, I would say focus on not necessarily, I would say build the rules first about what it is, and then attack both legacy data and new data at the same time. So don't necessarily rely on your users to classify the information, to identify the information. Instead, rely on a technology to automatically classify and then inform the user and allow the user to decide whether that's the right label or wrong label. We'll talk about this, I think, in other slides, though, but this is kind of an important concept, though, because when Heidi mentioned about kind of change management, essentially how do you get the users, the business involved in working with classifications? You might have an appreciation for how much training you'd have to do with your users. And I think if you just focus on the classification piece, you have to train your users on how to discover data. You have to train your users on what data is sensitive, which data is not sensitive. And I would argue that given the same piece of information and two different users, you'll get two different classifications. So this isn't necessarily a hard problem to solve. I think there's a data discovery component. There's many data discovery vendors out there that can help you figure out what data should be classified as, such that you don't rely on your users to understand what the data is, but rather you teach your users how to handle the data. So you don't have to teach your users that that credit cards are bad in this department, but they might be good in this department. Finally, okay, in this department. Instead, you teach your users that confidential data should be treated this way. Then you use technology to inform your users about what the technology is, or sorry, what the classification is, and then they presumably perform the right actions to that. So to follow up on, so how do you say, I think focusing on new data when you're just thinking about just classification, just applying labels, I think it's a worthwhile strategy when you need your users to do the discovery piece, but I encourage everyone to kind of evaluate technologies out there such that you can attack both at the same time, because you probably have terabytes, petabytes of legacy data, and yes, you're probably creating gigabytes or terabytes per day, but the risk is still there regardless. And I think your next point here about keeping labels simple kind of dovetails in what I was saying earlier about, if you have 20 different labels, it's going to be difficult to teach your users on how to either discover how to apply that label or how to even use that label. So keeping your labels, I would say, you have a rule of thumb, I think, Heidi. I say less than 5. I think you say 3, or is it I say 3 and you say 5? I forget what it is.
I say. Yeah.
Less than 10. Less than 5. Yeah.
Yeah, but you bring up a good point about the discovery as well. I know we've focused a lot on classification.
Classification is like the end result you want to get to, but and I think the point you make about focusing on new data, you have to, because it's so overwhelming to think about how do you discover your data. Well, if you have to teach all your users about how to apply labels, you have to start with new data first. You can't go tell your 10,000 users to go look at all petabytes of data and say go classify it. They'll say, yeah, right, they have jobs to do. But you can't teach them how to manage the data that's presented to them in a classification label, I believe.
Yeah, I think so too. And usually these are things that they really go hand in hand, discovery as well as classification. They make a lot of sense to be doing together. And and that point about keeping labels simple, yes, I usually point to 3, but I've certainly seen 4 in a lot of places as well. The issue, I think, with having 9 or 10 or just a bunch more is that it gets a lot harder for people to understand the nuance between the different labels and what that really means in terms of what or how they should be handling that type of information. Then you also run into issues of people trying to classify opportunistically so that they can access and use it however they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like how, some people might, how do I handle, internal level 3 or internal level 2? I think your point is just have an internal or a public and a confidential. We're oversimplifying things, obviously, but I think the point about minimizing labels is a good one.
And we can go into more detail, I think, in the next couple of slides as well. But the last point I wanted to make on this one is really consider the different kinds of employee populations you have when you're planning for classification. This also relates to the label discussion, but you might have certain groups within the company, for example, who maybe they require an added label for data that's unique to their group that doesn't really get used elsewhere. It could also be that a particular business unit, they're using a certain application or programs that others are not using, and maybe this is something that could conflict with the classification tool that you bring in. So just consider the different populations so that you can better test both the processes as well as the technologies to make sure that they work together before you do it.
And this is kind of another thing about the discovery piece of it, is that one group may not understand what's sensitive to another group. I use the case of like PCI, for example, just because it's easy for us to understand, right? So having credit card information, I guess, in your cardholder data environment is probably okay. And maybe the HR team or the HR, department doesn't necessarily, they might have credit card numbers, or they may not necessarily understand the impact of having credit card numbers, like, having them. So there's different departments, different employee populations have different perceptions of what risk is, or what is sensitive, what isn't sensitive. But make no mistake, the risk still stays the same in the organization. So regardless about whether your employees know what's sensitive, what's not sensitive, it's unlikely you're going to be able to train them all to be cognizant of all of them, especially the larger the enterprise you get. So be cognizant about that different employees are going to perceive things differently than others. So this kind of comes back into why keeping labels simple and short is a good one too as well. Again, so if you apply a real world example here, so if you apply a label to a spreadsheet that says confidential, do not distribute, and the employee sees it no matter which department they are in, presumably you train them to how to handle confidential, do not distribute. And they don't necessarily need to be aware of all the intricate details behind it.
That's a good point about the different perceptions. I've also seen this with perceptions about classification itself. I think for us who we're dealing with security, we're dealing with privacy, when we think classification, we think of classifying sensitive information. Whereas maybe some other groups within the company, they don't view it the same way. For example, this could be classification in the sense of, well, this particular document is a purchase order, whereas this is another.
Information management purposes, yeah, good point, yeah.
So just getting on that same understanding of what we're talking about with classification at the beginning can be helpful. All right, let's jump to the next slide. So we're talking about simplifying these levels of classification. So going back to that equation earlier of toxic data, just imagine that is that bigger orange triangle up top that encompasses both radioactive as well as toxic. So in some cases you could think of toxic data as your internal data. The radioactive stuff is the really super highly sensitive stuff. Perhaps this is where PII ends up. For example, this is where intellectual property ends up as well. But simplify. 3 levels is what I would recommend. I've seen 4, and AG, you've seen like 5, and so.
I've seen 5, yeah. And I don't think you're necessarily saying that people should use radioactive. I think this more kind of like a hierarchy to kind of have something super bad, something kind of bad, and something okay.
Yep, just clear distinctions between the 3. Yep, and we're not really hung up on particular wording either, so this is just suggestions. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is where we can start to see how simplified labels can help increase data awareness overall and how to handle something if it's labeled a particular way. So the example that I like to use is with boxes and shipping boxes. So you can have all these symbols on the outside to tell you how you need to handle this box. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what's in there. And you don't really need to know the language either, because the images, that kind of labeling, can give a pretty clear indication as to how this needs to be handled.
I like the little picture there of the Chinese or Japanese writing there. I guess it's a few different languages, but seeing that breaking glass, seeing that it's red, and seeing that it's up, you kind of know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, let's move on to the next one. So this is something that I've run up across pretty common with companies that I talk to. And the key point here is to realize that policies alone, they're not enough. So I run into organizations who, they do a really great job of documenting what their classification policy should be, what the labels mean, what the different controls, security controls would be required for each type of labeling. But then they stop. They don't bring in a tool at all to help them do this. They're relying on people to just simply type the word confidential at the top of a Word document, or put it in as a, say, like a header or a watermark of some sort. and that's asking a lot for people to do and to do consistently. So this is where you have to have both the policy side, the process side thought out, the people part of it, so that people understand what they're supposed to do, but then really bring in that technology, that tool to help you push through.
Yeah, I think technology here is kind of the important piece, obviously, but the technology helps automate everything. You can have a policy. Again, I go back to the example of having one piece of data and be classified 2 different ways by 2 different users. That's a real thing. That shouldn't happen, obviously, because whatever's sensitive in that document has the same amount of risk depending on which user classified it. The other thing too is you mentioned earlier, Heidi, too, is opportunistic classification. So you might have a policy that says that they should apply it confidential, like do not distribute, and maybe their DLP tool is preventing that from them attaching an email and sending to external. But someone might just manually reclassify it as public, distribution allowed to potentially leak something intentionally. So, technology can prevent those things from happening. Where what I mean by that, a real-world example is, you could have a policy. You could have a policy that describes what is confidential data. Using Heidi's example of, let's just say it has PII inside of it. So if there's PII in a document, the user's unaware of it or even aware of it, you can automatically apply that label to it and force that label from, you get the user the option to classify how they want to, but you might want to classify radioactive data or toxic data as being the highest hierarchy, I guess, of classification labels, and you won't let them necessarily remove it. And that's kind of, that's what Heidi's mentioning about policies are great, but you need some sort of some sort of technology to help facilitate the identification of it, the presenting it to the users, and the actual immutability of it, I guess. That's so.
So there's a question from the audience. It was actually referring to the prior slide, and the question is, what are the deliverables, dependencies, and required efforts for, excuse me, for data classification?
You go back to the previous slide. Yeah. Jog my memory. What's the previous slide? Hey, Doug, do you want to go back a slide? Can you or no?
I can, yeah. So the question was regarding the deliverables, dependencies, and required efforts for data classification.
Okay. So for me, I would say like deliverables, you definitely want that, well, I know we said policies alone aren't enough, but you certainly need that policy, that documentation in place. So something that
you need some sort of document, a simple kind of a one-pager document that describes what the levels are and samples of the data. So someone can glance at it. You can build training programs off of it, emails and user awareness of sending out, hey, these are the labels, this is the types of data, and it's not an end-all be-all about what it is, but it jogs people's memories are, what those three classification things are and what different types of data they could be, the different samples. So you need the kind of a high-level, this is what data classification is, and here's what these things are, and how to handle it, and then you need a kind of a more detailed policy that kind of, this is above my pay grade, but that in detail describes what classification is, what it isn't, or what high is, what medium is, etc., and specifically what those things should do and should not do. And that way you can build your, whatever control framework you're using, you can build your control framework around that. Heidi, did you have anything to add there? Or no?
Oh, just the one other point is that when you put that together, also have the contact information for someone to go to if they have additional questions or concerns about. I mean, other things I've seen in these policy documents include purpose. Why do we even bother to do this? And also maybe in other cases I've seen just references to, well, here are the key compliance requirements that say we have to do this as an organization.
So in terms of required efforts, I've heard of organizations form committees, have legal and compliance involved, as well as cross-functional stakeholders all be involved in the definition of those classifications.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you run this at any one of those, if privacy tries to run it by themselves and not have any other stakeholders, nothing's going to get through. If IT tries to run it, IT might say, oh, this is a great idea, we should go classify all of our data. It's a absolute cross-functional coordination effort across the entire company. That just not necessarily just goes with building the policy, but also the implementation of it as well too. I've seen hundreds of projects fail because there hasn't been that coordination. And I've also seen some very successful projects where all facets of the business are aware of what they need to do, legal, privacy, IT, security, etc. Absolutely. So the required effort, it's actually going to be kind of based on how large or how diverse your organization is. I've seen some people, some projects, with a 1-2 page about what data classification is, but circulated amongst everybody, they're aware of it, and they kind of use that document, that 1-pager, to get on the same pages with everybody. But I've also seen, some people build 300-page classification schemas that don't go anywhere. So there's that as well. So
300. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Yeah. That was a legal heavy company. Lawyers like to build policies and just policy their way out of an issue, which doesn't always work.
Yeah, I agree with that need for just broader sort of cross-stakeholder representation to help kick this off. And it's not just the practical points about developing what that policy, what the classification scheme would look like. It's also just being able to get everyone on that same page to socialize this, to really get as much executive support as you can, even going up to the highest levels.
And they all generally have their own reasons for data classification. Obviously, legal has their own requirements for classification. I don't want to say requirements, but if you present like data classification to them, legal will say, oh yeah, that'd be great if we could do this. Same thing with privacy, even IT. So having, I think presenting to them what data classification provides, they'll jog their memory and they'll be definitely engaged into the project.
So there's a follow-on question from the same person. If we have all the documentations in place, what about the technology tools? And secondly, do we need to have an asset management in place? And he adds for CIA. I'm not sure what CIA refers to.
Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Yeah, I believe it's not. I believe it's that, and not Central Intelligence Agency. But yeah. So no, so I mean, obviously I can't speak for all technologies, but for our technology, Spirion, no, you don't need asset management in place. We kind of expected that, many organizations have a various maturity level of asset management. Of course, we can leverage the existing ones that they have already, or there can be none already. For example, I don't want to get too in the tech piece of it, but just to paint the picture for everybody, you can deploy an MSI out to everything, to all the machines, and have it report back into a central location, sort of building a rudimentary asset management system, because presumably you have to know where the data is to kind of assign some sort of risk level to it. So we don't require any sort of asset management for our technology, although we do integrate with them. And the confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective, so I take it to mean that you have some sort of asset management system which has some sort of values kind of assigned to each one of the assets. Again, if you have that information, and I'd love for you to kind of explore a website, or ask one of come into the do a demo essentially. But if you have that sort of attributed information, that context information can sometimes inform the risk level of the data. If you have an asset that is high on the availability side, high on the integrity side, and high on the confidentiality side, if you find sensitive data on that machine, no matter what it is, you may want to increase the classification to that. And my point is that if that information is available to our technology, you can automate the classification accordingly. I don't want to make it too much about technology, but I did want to answer that question. Sorry about that, Heidi.
Oh, no, I think that was a good response. I mean, I don't really see in other cases with other tools that there is such a dependency. I think the great thing about the tools that I do see on the market today is that you bring them in, and they're meant to augment and help with other initiatives that you might have around security and privacy. So you're not really relying on having one or multiple other things in place first. And in some cases, I'm starting to see classification come in more as a feature function within other tools as well. Maybe this is also a good opportunity to jump to the next slide, the one that was after the policies one. It's a little bit more related to the technology discussion.
And there's another question, if I can insert here. According to the change management strategy, what are the role of the change manager in data classification?
The role of the change manager. I'd say a key role here is to be putting together a communications plan and figuring out how to better message the classification initiative to employees, to let them know that this is coming, these are the expectations, how this might affect their workflow, for example, or the things that they would need to do or not do. What these classification labels mean in terms of, well, if you are working with a document that's labeled confidential, this is the appropriate way to handle it. Did you have anything to add to that, AG? On the change management side of things, the role of that person. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was. I was saying I kind of get confused about some of that when you say change management, because I'm kind of in my head I'm thinking IT change management, but I think you're kind of referring it to more of like a cultural change, like getting people to be aware of data classification and changing the organization to be into that. I would kind of come back to the role of the change manager is to inform them of the data classification schema, the high level. What are the three things, and why are we doing it? What are those three things, and what are some samples of those three things? And how to handle those things. If you could only do one of those things, it would be how to handle the information. 'Cause that's the most important piece. That's the whole reason why you're doing classification. I believe. I mean, you're trying to get users to be aware of the data. I mean, you as an organization want to be aware of all pieces of data, but ultimately you're trying to drive changing users' behavior. So if you could have a technology that automatically presented to them what something was, whether it's high, medium, or low, and then how to behave with high, medium, or low, I would argue that you've significantly reduced your risk. I mean, obviously you haven't reduced any nefarious actors there, but you've significantly reduced risk in that you've made your user aware of the data and how they should handle it. That's what I would add.
One more question. Do we need, and I'm assuming, do organizations need to formulate a committee for data classification, and when should they? You kind of alluded to this, but that question came up again.
I don't think it needs to be a completely separate committee. In some cases, I've seen this be a task that an existing privacy committee has spearheaded, or another committee that's overseeing data governance has taken on.
Agreed.
I think in those cases, it's a matter of figuring out just priorities. Would we focus on classification here, or do we need to focus on something else first? So just being able to make the case that this is something that is a foundational component of so much more of all these other efforts you may be trying to do is something that can help to elevate that discussion and to push this forward.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, yeah. So I could talk all day about this slide, But Heidi, did you have a point about user-driven or automated?
Yeah, I bring this up because it's a question that I get from my clients where they're asking, well, if I'm looking at classification solutions, should I be going towards something that's user-driven? So having my employees be the ones to apply those tags, those labels, or should I be looking at something that has automated capabilities so that we just don't involve the user at all? And my response is, well, you need both. And the great thing is that solutions typically come with both capabilities today, so you're not forced to make that either or decision, and there's really a place for each of these capabilities at different points when you're trying to classify.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You definitely have to do both, and to be more specific, I would say do automation where possible, and in the event that you can't automate, then you know, allow the user to apply something. And what I mean by that is you know, visualize a user working in a Word document, and you know, allow them to apply some sort of envision a user using an Excel document. Allow them to apply a classification however they see fit. However, if there's some sort of hidden column in there with PII, social security numbers, you probably want to have some automation that says, hey, this is actually, you know, who cares whatever the user classified it as, because there's actually data inside of there, so this is the label it's going to be. The trouble with that, like automatically applying, like the problem with automation in general is garbage in, garbage out. If you are inaccurately identifying data, if you are not precise with it, you will apply a label that may not necessarily be the right label. And then, as if you're part of the religion about building your business processes around the classification labels, now your downstream business processes, your downstream automation on those classification labels is going to be entirely out of sync, not working correctly, not again, garbage in, garbage out. If you know, let's say someone wants to apply a label public to an earnings release, but for whatever reason there's some confidential information in there, maybe some confidential project name or something like that in there, and they're not aware of it. They're trying to make it public so they can try to send it out. But if you're using automatic discovery and classification, you want to automatically apply it and say do not allow. Now, if you inaccurately classify it and say, oh, like yeah, if you inaccurately identify it as being confidential, and you're preventing that user from doing something with other technologies, tell you what, the user is going to figure out a way to do something and get around it. The user will always figure out how to get their job done. Well, I'm going to say always, but if someone needs to do something, they're going to do it, whether a good actor or a bad actor. So I want to drive home the point about accuracy and precision there, and that's usually done with the discovery piece of it. And if you can accurately discover something, then you can rest assured that your classification will be accurate as well too. But if you, again, back to garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm. And I think on the automated piece, it's also the discovery piece of that applies, but also if it's here's a suggested classification and having a person be able to confirm that, that's another use case there as well.
Great. There's a couple of questions that just came in. The first one is, so far you're focusing on CIA of the information. How do we combine security CIA with the information data required to improve a company's performance?
Say it again.
Yeah. How do we combine security CIA with the information or data required to improve a company's performance?
So to me, this sounds like with the classifications, being able to improve security of the controls that we put around the data, but also having that be usable for the business. Is that the correct way of interpreting that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so because it kind of goes back to the general idea that if you don't know what your data is, you can't protect it. Like, you know, I remember John Kindervag, no longer with Forrester, but John Kindervag would say, Secret Service's job is to protect the president. They're able to do that because they know where the president is at all times. If they didn't know where the president was, how could they be appropriately protecting the president? Same thing here with your data. Same thing here with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If you're applying the right labels based on what that information is, then I think you're able to build the right controls, build the right processes in place to ensure that there is the right amount of confidentiality, there is the right amount of integrity, and the right amount of availability applied. Hopefully that answered the question, but that's the way I see it, is that knowing what your data is and allows you to, let's say, paint with a broad stroke of how to make sure that the data is in the right place at the right time and not in the places where it's not supposed to be.
Yeah, I tend to see that more as with classification, you can better right-size the kinds of controls that you have over different types of data, to the point where, especially if you have like a privacy committee overseeing this kind of effort, or at least people who are thinking about data privacy issues, it becomes this conversation not of, well, here are the things we can't do with it, but it becomes more of a conversation of, well, these are the things that we can do, and having that be more clearly laid out. And was there any other follow-on questions from that?
Not related to this specific topic, but there was another question. Is it possible to build data classification on a department level, or should it be on the organization-wide level?
Oh, that's a good one. So when we go back to that, the concept of simplifying the levels for classification, I tend to point to that as, well, this is your company-wide labeling. But when you get into certain departments, certain groups, you might find that you have exceptions. Maybe they need an extra label. Maybe they need some sub-labels. And that's certainly something that I see companies doing as well. There might be one overarching one for the enterprise. So let's say you've got radioactive, toxic, and public data. But let's say within the finance group, maybe toxic gets broken out. There's like another sub-label underneath that that's only specific to finance because they're the only ones who are working with that type of data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen sub-classifications, and it kind of depends on whether your classification technology can do multi-labels or even sub-labels. We can do those things, but I've seen it. I wouldn't recommend it, but I do see the need for it sometimes. But from if you think about it, which one should I do? Well, I would say do whichever one that you can do, because something's better than nothing. So if you only have like scope within a department, you can start building classification rules and schemes for that one department only. You can start small and then expand out. There's nothing that's going to preclude you from with any technology. There's nothing that's going to preclude you from getting started. It's going to be, and what I mean by scope is you're going to want to you're going to want to, you're going to want to assign the classification labels according to that department organization's, their needs. So, if you have, if you're just to take an example, like the financial department, you're probably still going to want to have high, medium, or low there, because again, you're going to talk about how they handle it. So if you have it like, if in the financial department you have, let's be very specific, like earnings, income sheet, balance sheet, I guess finance people might be able to know how to handle each one of those things. But consider when that data consider when the classification goes beyond that department, and then now someone else is looking at, that's an income sheet or a balance sheet or something like that, or income statement or balance sheet. Are they going to know what to do with it? Maybe, maybe not. So I would say try, I've seen both, but consider the immediate needs, but also consider what it's going to look like when it explodes out from that one department.
That's a good tip. All right, well, let's jump on to the next slide. So I often find that with DLP discussions, classification comes up quite a bit. And so this is just a way to illustrate what we see as 5 pretty key process stages for maturity for a DLP program. And if you're also trying to implement a DLP technology within your company. It really starts with data discovery, just understanding where your data is, classifying it, understanding what it is that you're trying to protect, and consolidate. This next process stage here is typically something that is helpful after you've gone through this exercise of discovery, because you might find that, well, there's data showing up in places that you didn't know it was actually there. Maybe it shouldn't be there. Maybe you're finding duplicates of data in different places. So consolidate is just a good process stage here to help clean house a bit, reduce the sprawl where you can. And then finally getting to design what those DLP policies should be, what the appropriate enforcement actions and controls would look like before you turn things on and get them going to enforce the policies that you've put in place. Okay, we can move on to the next one.
We have a question. So the question is, how do organizations measure the effectiveness of the classification process?
Oh, that's a really good question. Measuring the effectiveness. I've seen folks try to do this in the sense of like what percentage of their data is classified and how quickly they're able to get to that point. I think that would be one way of doing it. Have you seen any other types of measurements or metrics, AG?
Yeah, I've seen people go after high priorities first, so not necessarily like a percentage, but we want to make sure that we have all of our high, no matter where it is, first classified, and then go into like the smaller state, the other changes, the other classification labels. I've seen a few different customers take this approach, and it's kind of a risk-based approach. So think about it, or a compliance-driven approach. So think about GDPR and some of the timelines that are there for 2018, which is very fast approaching. They want to make sure that they have all their GDPR data like located immediately, because they know that it's going to take them a few months to actually begin to use your slide here, consolidate some of that data, figure out what to do with it. They didn't care too much about like necessarily, what is the medium level or even general PII or general like PCI information, because in the large scheme of things, the GDPR data, it being unknown, represented the largest risk to them. So they needed to know where it was as quickly as possible and the extent of its sprawl. And then, yes, there's other data that they want to know where it is, but it doesn't present as large of a risk to them at that point in time. So when you talk about measurement, measuring that, you're going to have some sort of a percentage of data. And it can be, I wouldn't necessarily represent it. I mean, you could represent it in terabyte, size of it, but I think it's probably more. I would, if I were running the program, I would probably represent it as assets searched. So whether you're thinking about applications or departments, down to the endpoints, server names, etc., I almost kind of think of it that way, because think of a Windows machine, right? You have 8 terabytes of Windows stuff, and maybe only 8 gigabytes of Windows things, Windows system internals. So you may have like 100 megs of actual real data. If you search, do you say that you searched 8.1 gigabytes, and yeah, hooray, or is it really important that you search that 100? So quantity is or size of data, I would not say is. You can do it that way, but I also think it's more about the breadth of where you searched. It depends on how you organize as well too. So I've seen some organizations who are organized by like applications, so they just have 300 different application teams, and they kind of push down classification policies and the change management kind of communication down to each one of the application owners. And then so each application owner kind of coming back and saying, yep, good to go, yep, we're done, yep, we're done. I've seen it measured that way. I've seen it measured a multitude of different ways, but that's one way that I did like was by department or by asset.
So I really like that with the risk approach.
Yeah, I mean, why search application? Why search an application that doesn't really have a high risk to it, though? So exactly.
And AG, to expand on that too, in terms of measuring and knowing where you're searching, is it helpful to understand what is classified, what has been found and has been classified versus has not been classified, so that you can understand your risk posture?
No, I mean, yes and no. But I would say no, because classifications should be kind of an active thing. So when data is changed, let's just say you have a Word document and it is classified as not public because there's nothing inside there. That's marked as classified. Is a job done? No, because if someone opens up a document and pastes in some sensitive data and then saves it, well, you're going to want a technology that like automatically figures out, what the new classification is. So the fact that the document was classified in the first place, awesome, but you really need to be concerned about the new data that's being created, and that's necessarily could be old data that's been modified. So it's a continuous process. So it's not a one and done thing.
Great. So an expansion on that question someone asked is, how do organizations monitor it in addition to measure it?
Monitor it. I mean, I can answer it different ways, but Heidi, what's your thoughts? Monitor
so
it.
Monitoring that kind of necessary change, I think.
Or monitoring classifications in general.
Mm.
Doug, do you have any idea what
I think classification, it's a follow-on to the previous question, so classification as a whole.
I mean, understanding like how much as a percentage of your data that, of all the things that have been classified, what's what? Or do you have hundreds of, is there do you have hundreds of high and, tens of public? But again, it's kind of dependent on what you did first and whatnot. So there's a multitude of ways of monitoring it. I think the real monitoring is kind of comes into the follow-on. After your data has been classified, do you have the appropriate controls around that data? So, for example, yes, you wouldn't classify all this data. Let's say all the high stuff. Do you have the right controls around the high stuff? So monitoring how much unprotected data, and I'm using unprotected kind of loosely here, but is your high data, is it sitting on a file share with read access to everybody? That might be okay, but is that really what you want to do? So monitoring, is the data being used and stored appropriately? That's kind of what you want to monitor. Is that's what that? But you can't do that unless you obviously know what your classifications are in the first place. But I think monitoring the use of it and how people are using it is the key metric there.
I would agree, and I think this is where we can see some of the DLP tools coming into play. Because if they're able to read these classification labels and they see that the data is being moved, or maybe someone's trying to email it out or upload it to the cloud in some form, and the solution knows that, well, this is not allowed for something that's classified with this kind of label, that gives you a bit of an indicator in terms of just how this information is being used. So that's one kind of way of monitoring, I think. It's also another way of being able to see what potential patterns might be cropping up between what something is classified as versus how people are actually trying to use it. So that might be an indicator that, well, do we need to go back and rethink this because perhaps the controls in place aren't quite aligned with how it needs to be.
Good point. Agreed.
I did want to do a quick time check because we have 5 slides left. It's 1 minute before the top of the hour. There is a question directly related to the last 5.
Let's blow through the last 5 slides really quick and then hit that last question. If anybody has any additional questions, I'm fine to answer on. Heidi, you probably have a little buffer here as well too. But let's blow through the last couple of slides to finish that off, and then we'll get to that question.
Mm-hmm.
If that works.
Yep, I've got to drop in a little bit, but let's keep going through. We can get through these pretty quickly, I think.
Sure, and if we can't get to anybody's questions, there are a few that have popped up. We'll respond to you by email.
Next slide.
So building the case for classification, a couple of things to keep in mind. I think we can, the more that we can tie classifications benefits into other metrics, impact on security maturity that you might be tracking, the better you have the chances for building your case around this. So for example, metrics like, let's say, employee experience. Maybe data can now be easier to use, easier to access or share, which goes on to help increase productivity. Or maybe because with classification, you can raise the level of data awareness and data handling, what's appropriate data handling among your employees, and that helps to reduce the number of security incidents that happen because of just accidental mishandling of information. And maybe you're also able to reduce the volume of data stored, reduce your surface area of risk by getting rid of data that's no longer needed, and doing so with confidence. So these are just examples of how classifications benefits can tie into some of these other metrics you might be tracking. And next. You can also recognize that whatever you do with classification, it's just the beginning. So these are just a couple of sort of next steps following classification. We can go on to the next one as well. So a second point about building your case here is that if you think about the security strategy that you currently have in place, any kind of major frameworks you might be using, whether it's say ISO or NIST or maybe COBIT or the Forrester one, a lot of these, they oftentimes point to classification as one of the key pieces for these frameworks. So if that's the case, that certainly gives you a better argument to say that we're basing our security strategy on this, we're building off of this, and therefore we just have to go through with classification. But classification is always something here that can help you to scope out other projects as well, help you prioritize your efforts around things like DLP, around things like encryption. And then next slide, our last one here, is that I think the more you can tie classification into some other upcoming or current initiatives that would relate to classification and could benefit from classification, the better. Some examples that I've seen are things like, well, we're migrating to SharePoint. It'd be nice if we could just use this opportunity to also classify our data starting there. The move to Office 365 is another opportunity. So is something that you might be doing around data governance, and especially today, GDPR. What are we doing to prepare for that? Classification is certainly one of those foundational components to help us get a better handle over our sensitive data that would fall under GDPR. And yes, that's all from the slide front. And this is my contact information if anyone would like to reach out if you have any additional questions. But thank you again for taking the time and joining us today on this webinar.
So Heidi and AG, if you don't mind, there's just a couple of questions. If you can, we could spend a couple more minutes. And if any of the attendees want to stay on the line to hear the questions and answers. Are you okay for a couple of more minutes, or do you have to go?
Unfortunately, no. I'm back to back today, getting pinged for the next call.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. If we couldn't get to your question, we'll reply to you by email. Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, AG.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, all.
Bye.
Bye.